Alright. Hey YouTube, I'm Lucky, and in today's video, we're going to be doing something pretty ambitious, which is ranking all of the pulse rifles currently in Destiny 2, all the ones that are not Sunset, that is, from best to worst, S tier, A tier, B tier, and C tier for PvP. I've spent a lot of time, several hours now, compiling this list, looking at all the different perks, testing things out, and I'm very excited to bring this to y'all because I think that you'll really like this list, just as you liked the recent hand cannon list that I made if you haven't seen that video. So the way I'm going to organize this is I'm going to start off with the fastest fire rate pulse rifles and work my way down to the slowest fire rate. So first up we have the 540 RPMs, then we'll go to the 450 lightweights, then we'll go to the 450 aggressive burst. If you don't know, there's two different 450 types. One is lightweight, one is aggressive 4-round burst. Then you have the 390 adaptives, and then you have the 340 high impacts, and then of course there's two oddballs that are just completely different from all the others because Bungie, right? So starting off first with the first 540 RPM S tier pulse rifle, we have the Peace of Mind. Of course, this is going to be the first one we talk about because this is like the #1 most used pulse rifle in PvP and trials recently. Of course, the GODROLL you're looking for is to craft it, and you're going to want perpetual motion and elemental capacitor on that. Now, keep in mind when you do craft this with elemental capacitor to get that like really high stability, you're probably going to want to use a void subclass. So if you're not rocking the void subclass, probably not going to have as much fun using this bad boy, but that's why we're going to talk about some other 540s that are also S tier where you don't have to use a void subclass in a minute here. We have the Horror's Least pulse rifle, which just recently came out. Now, we don't have the adept version yet, but the adept version would be just that much more sick. This thing gets to roll with kill clip, which you don't see very often on the 540s. The 540s are just super, super lethal, and they're flinch machines because they just spam so many bullets. Very good in PvP. You can get perpetual motion and kill clip on this bad boy, which is a crazy roll. Definitely desirable currently, and when the adept version comes out, this thing will be that much better and will certainly be S tier in PvP. The next one we're going to talk about is the Iron Banner pulse rifle, which is the Time-Worn Spire. Now, again, this is one where you don't have to use a certain subclass, like you don't have to use Void. So if you're trying to use like Solar 3.0, or maybe Arc 3.0 for next season, you get the advantage of using this, so you don't have to use elemental capacitor. It does have Iron Grip, which is going to slow your reload speed down quite a bit, but it gives you that plus 20 stability, which is definitely what you want when you're using something like this in PvP. You want to not flinch, so you want as high stability as you can possibly get on this weapon. You can go with Moving Target in the other slot for the Time-Worn Spire, or you could go Slideways, but Slideways is not nearly as good as like a 3-second cooldown, so it's up to you to decide what GODROLL you want to go for, but that is definitely an S tier weapon. These all have really good stats and are all super lethal in PvP. The fourth one we're going to talk about in the last S tier 540 RPM is the Darkest Before. If you haven't used this thing yet, this thing I've spoken so highly about for so long, you can get Slide Shot and Elemental Capacitor on this. Of course, if you use an Elemental Capacitor, you're going to have to go back to using a Void subclass. Slide Shot is so good, you can pretty much max out the stability on this, turn this thing into a laser gun, absolutely beam people, flinch them like crazy. Very, very good 540 RPM. Now we're going to go down the list to something that's not S tier in the 540 RPMs, which is the Jurassic Green. They basically gave this thing like green level stats, like it's like a green pulse rifle practically in terms of its base stats. All the other 540s had really good substantial stats, but this one terrible, so we're going to put this all the way down in the B tier. It actually would be in the C tier, but the only saving grace for this Jurassic Green is that it does roll with Rangefinder. So Rangefinder, multi-kill clip, probably the best roll of that weapon, but definitely a C tier pulse rifle. Next, we'll talk about the Grid Skipper pulse rifle. This will be the last 540 RPM that we'll talk about. The worst of the 540s, due to its like crazy zoom, makes you flinch like unbelievably. It's not a very good pulse to use currently. It's got Slideways and multi-kill clip. It's basically just outclassed by stats by everything else in the 540 archetype. So Grid Skipper gets the harsh C tier rating. And now it's time to work our way up to the next archetype. We'll be talking about the 450 lightweight frames, and we'll be talking about Bad Juju first up. Bad Juju is so good. It basically is like the Ace of Spades of exotic pulse rifles. If you haven't been using this thing, use this. So good. Has really good stats, reloads itself, just everything. Everything you could want in a pulse rifle, the Bad Juju has. So the Bad Juju is absolutely S tier in PvP. The next one we'll be talking about is the Bxr55 Battler. Obviously, this came out with the 30th anniversary event, and most people know this thing to be extremely good. Just such a stable pulse rifle, so good in every way. Everything you want in a pulse rifle is the Bxr55 Battler. It rolls perpetual motion and kill clip, which is just unbelievably good. Like, this is like probably my favorite pulse rifle to use if I'm going to use a legendary pulse rifle. inside PvP. So the Battler gets the S tier rating as well. Moving on to the next one, the next 450, we're going to be talking about the Outbreak Perfected. Now the Outbreak is a really good exotic, has like deceivingly high stability when you're using it. It doesn't read as a high stability stat when you look at it up on its data, but it seems to be extremely stable. And I'm going to give it the A tier rating because it doesn't have the crazy impressive perks like Bad Juju or the BXR, but definitely a good exotic pulse rifle and definitely solid inside PvP. Next up, we'll talk about the Chattering Bone here. Now this is something you get from the Last Wish, and Last Wish might be getting removed. Some of these weapons might be getting removed pretty soon here. We'll see if when King's Fall arrives next season, if they end up removing the Last Wish. That's to be determined at this point in time. The best roll for the Chattering Bone is actually the Curated roll, which gives you Kill Clip and High Impact Reserves, which is really, really good, especially for these 450s. That's going to be a very, very nice weapon and has good base stats overall, so we're definitely giving that the A tier rating on the Chattering Bone. Moving up the list now, we're going to talk about the Ogma, which recently came into the game with the Witch Queen, and this one for PvP actually can roll Perpetual Motion and Wellspring. Now it's not the best roll overall. You would probably look for a better damage boosting perk like Kill Clip or something like that. So because of that, we're putting this a little bit lower down on the list. We don't have any Kill Clip, we don't have any those really S tier perks that we look for on these pulse rifles, so we're putting the Ogma down in the B tier for PvP. Now let's move on to the next archetype, which is the other 450s, which is the 4-round burst. They're aggressive 4-round bursts. So if you don't know, there's different archetypes of the 450s. Don't confuse the two. I don't know why they made them the same RPM, but we're going to talk about these. And the first one up is the Sacred Provenance, which is one you get from the Garden Raid. This thing is a beast. If you haven't used this thing or been using this thing is so good. Its base stats are off the charts. It rolls Rapid Hit, Kill Clip. So good. Definitely an S tier pulse rifle and something worth using. There's only 2 of these 450 aggressive frames, 4-round bursts in the game. And the second one is the one you get from the Raid, the Vow. We've got Insidious, the Adept version. You can roll Rapid Hit and Rampage on this bad boy. So not nearly as good as the last one, the Sacred Provenance, in terms of perks, but still a really good pulse rifle, really strong base stats. These pulse rifles, these 4-round bursts, are actually pretty lethal and pretty impressive in PvP if you haven't been using them. Next, we'll move on to a new archetype of pulse rifles, which are the 390 RPMs. The strongest 390 RPM pulse rifle in PvP is the Last Perdition. The reason why is because this thing can roll Rangefinder and Kill Clip, which is so good. All you need is a small damage boosting perk on the 390 RPM in order for it to 2-burst. So you can use like Rampage, you can use like Multi-Kill Clip. You can use anything that's pretty simple to proc. Obviously, there's certain perks that work well for PvP and certain ones that don't. Like, for example, One for All is very hard to proc in PvP. It certainly would work for 2-bursting with a 390, but Kill Clip has a longer timer and is going to make that 2-burst just that much easier because it's a significantly bigger boost to damage than 1 stack of Rampage. So Rangefinder Kill Clip on the Last Perdition is beast, and we're definitely going to put that in the A tier category though. Not in the S tier, because even still you have to get the first kill with just Rangefinder procced in order to get to that really high time to kill. So I don't want to put that quite as high ranking or quite as lethal as the others. I think that the 390 archetype is probably the weakest archetype of pulse rifle in PvP currently. Feel free to disagree down in the comments below if you choose to do so. Next up, we're going to talk about the Iron Banner pulse rifle, the Forge's Pledge, another 390 RPM. It does have some really good base stats. It's got Surplus for stability, and you've got Multi-Kill Clip, which is going to be really important. Again, for these 390s, you need a small damage boost, so that way you can reload or get a kill with Rampage, and the next kill you get will be a 2-burst, giving you a significant boost in time to kill. And so we're going to give that the B tier rating, though, again, because the 390s just aren't quite as strong. Next up, we'll talk about the Hailing Confusion. Okay, this is one you get from Europa. For this one, we actually don't have that damage boosting perk that we're looking for, but it does have really good base stats. We've got Surplus and Elemental Capacitor, so if you want to use a 390, one that has just like laser beam potential, one that's just going to fire, very stable, this is definitely the option for you. You're not going to ever get that 2-burst that you're looking for with the Hailing Confusion, so we could have probably ranked it lower than B, but I still feel like it's a good pulse overall because of its base stats. Next up, we'll talk about the third Axiom Pulse Rifle, another 390 archetype. This one can roll Rangefinder, Multi-Kill Clip. Now that Multi-Kill Clip May not be as good as Kill Clip in terms of how much it boosts your damage, but it is enough after 1 kill to get you that 2 bursts. So, you know, rangefinder, multi-kill clip, pretty solid overall. And we'll give this the B tier rating for the 3rd axiom. Next up, we're going to talk about the Geon 7, the 390. This one does have Rampage, but Rampage is probably the weaker of the perks because it has such a short timer. So we're going to have to use probably Firmly Planted Rampage as the god roll for this. Just really not that solid of a PvP weapon. So we're unfortunately giving the Geon 7 the C tier rating. So put it down pretty low there. It's already the worst archetype, and it doesn't even get the best PvP perks. So pretty low rating for the Geon. Next up, we'll talk about the Syncopation. Now, even though you can craft this weapon, and you can get like Enhanced Moving Target, Enhanced Rangefinder, it still just doesn't have the good perks you're looking for. You know, it would be nice if this had the damage boosting perks so you can hit those 2 bursts. Because you can't, we have to rank this thing really low because it just has poor overall time to kill. And 390s are just not it in PvP, in my opinion. Next up, we'll talk about the last 390. We have the Exotic, which is the Collective Obligation. This thing just doesn't have the right perks for PvP. You have to affect things with Void and just doesn't really work very well. So we're putting that down in the C tier rating. So you already know that that's going to be C tier though. So let's move on to the next archetype. All right. The next archetype that we're going to be talking about is going to be the 340 high impacts. And of course, the king of the high impacts is none other than Messenger, the Messenger Adept. This thing is so good. If you haven't been using this thing in PvP, if you haven't been absolutely blasted by this thing with Desperado before, you need to get a roll of this. You need to use this thing. Rapid Hit and Desperado is the god roll you're looking for. Easily the best of this archetype. The king of pulse rifles of the aggressive frame ones. Next up, we've got the No Time to Explain Exotic 340. Now, this thing is just an all-around workhorse. Its exotic perk is so good. Overall, it has just such good range, good stats, everything. The No Time to Explain is absolutely S tier inside PvP. We see it often hit the top charts in the Destiny 2 Trials meta report. Next up, we'll talk about the Stars and Shadow, the first aggressive frame to fall down, or high impact frame, not aggressive frame rather. The first one to fall down to the A tier. The reason why is its perks aren't nearly as strong. It has to compete against, you know, Rapid Hit and Desperado, and that's really tough to fight against. And so we're going to put the Stars and Shadow down in the A tier. It still does get Surplus and Elemental Capacitor, and these this frame of Pulse Rifle does 2 burst. So if you do spec into the extremely high stability of these, you could just 2 burst people really consistently and have a lot of fun with the Stars and Shadow. You could probably make a claim for Stars and Shadow to be S tier if you didn't really care much for Desperado, but Desperado is just such a good perk. Even after it's been nerfed, it's still just such a good perk, and definitely pushes the Messenger 1 tier above the Stars and Shadow, in my opinion. Next up, we're going to talk about the new purpose. Now, this thing came from the dungeon, and we're giving this the A tier rating. We've got Perpetual Motion and Desperado, which is still a really good roll, but just doesn't have the base stats like the Messenger does, and so we can't quite rank it quite as high. The Messenger just has such crazy stats, and you can put on the Messenger, the most important thing is you can put the Adept mods on it. So you could put like Adept Stability, which you can't put on the new purpose, and that's really the key winning factor of why the Messenger stands out above the new purpose. Although I will say the new purpose is probably in between A and S tier because it's so close to being as good as the Messenger. It's just that, you know, those Adept mods are actually really worth it, especially when you're talking about Adept Stability. So that gets the A tier rating, and then next up we will talk about the Legal Action 2. Now this thing goes all the way down to the B tier rating. While it is that aggressive frame, or that high impact frame rather, and does have the 2 burst potential, this thing, its best rolls is Heating Up and Rampage, which is a really good roll. And it does have really good range on it, but just doesn't stack up against the Messenger or the new purpose. So we're giving that the B tier rating. And moving on to the last two. Now these last two here are pretty laughable, okay? We've got the Premonition. Now the best roll of the Premonition is Surplus and Headseeker for PvP, which is definitely not it. And its stats overall are actually pretty bad too. So we're definitely giving the Premonition the C tier rating. Not a weapon you should use in PvP, in my opinion. And the last one of the high impact frames is the Cold Denial. If you use this thing in PvP and think it's good, you are in fact in Cold Denial. This thing is just bad. Its best roll is Killing Wind and Eye of the Storm. Not it. Definitely not it. Bad stats, bad perks. Cold Denial is bad, and it has to compare against the Messenger. There's no way. There's just no way you can compare those two. So the Cold Denial gets the harsh C tier rating. Now we've gone through every archetype of weapon, except there are two weird ones. Okay, the two weird ones are the Graviton Lance, and then we have the last one we'll go over in just a moment. The Graviton Lance right there, we're going to put down at the C tier. It fires 2-round bursts. Okay, the reason why I gave it the C tier rating, it has an overall time to kill value of 1 second, which is the equivalent of, basically the equivalent of a 120 RPM hand cannon, so not nearly as potent or lethal as a lot of other pulse rifles. It's always had a bad time to kill value, so unfortunately Graviton Lance needs a big buff if you want to see this thing in PvP. And then the last exotic pulse rifle we're going to talk about of all of them is the Vigilance Swing. The Vigilance Swing is kind of hard to base because it doesn't have the craziest time to kill, but because it shoots 5-round bursts, it just tends to flinch people so much and has a really good ease of use. A lot of you might argue with me that it's probably more A tier than it is S tier, but if you haven't been giving the Vigilance Swing a try in PvP recently, this thing just is a real workhorse and flinches people like crazy, and people just surprisingly don't expect to get 2 bursts by it and melted regularly because it's just a really good pulse rifle, and overall probably one of the best pulse rifles in PvP in my opinion. So that's it. That's the entire ranking of every pulse rifle currently in Destiny 2. Let me know down in the comment section below if you agree or disagree with any of my assessments of any of these pulse rifles. I'll happily hear you out, and I'll probably be making a few more tier lists here pretty soon, so make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Smash the like button. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Later.